So one of the coolest things about recent science revolves around fMRI technology, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what this helps us to do is to see how blood flows to different parts of the brain as humans are exposed to different experiences. And in this particular picture, you can see that there is a very specific play circuitry, very close to the reptilian part of the brain, the part that's very close to the stem of the brain that's connected to our nervous system. It was the very early part of the brain to develop. After that is the emotional brain, and then after that, on the cortex, the neocortex, is the rational thinking brain. And so play is much more instinctive in the way that it is identified through the brain images. It also shows how play is one circuitry out of 7 emotional circuitries. So it's a particular grouping in the brain that actually gets activated simply by having individuals observe pictures of play tools. So let's say that you see a bat from baseball, right? That triggers not only one small part of the brain that points to the bat being oriented towards play, but it highlights the whole emotional circuitry of play. And so it seems like very early on in our evolution as Homo sapiens, that play factor was essentially baked into the most visceral and ancestral parts of the brain. And now I want to show you Peter Gray, one of the leading neuroscientists in the area of play, talking about how this actually developed.
Researchers have conducted laboratory experiments in which they've deprived young animals, usually this is done with rats, but sometimes with monkeys, of the opportunity to play as they're growing up. And they've developed ways of doing this without depriving them of other social experiences. At least with rats, they developed ways of doing this. The result is that when these young animals develop, they are socially and emotionally crippled. When you place one of these play-deprived animals in a somewhat novel, somewhat frightening environment, they overreact with fear. They freeze in the corner, they don't adapt to it, they don't explore the environment as a normal animal would.
To be even more specific, believe it or not, I spent the last weekend reading heaps of rat experiment articles. And what the scientists have noticed when they're able to separate a particular group of rats away from their play experiences, particularly around week 4 and 5 of their development, is that those particular rats immediately start to show really strange social behavior. So when normal rats that have played, are introduced into the environment of the non-play rats, the non-play rats interact much less with its environment and with the rats inside of that environment. One very specific way they see that is by determining how often rats smell each other's butts. That's the way that they essentially communicate with one another in initial phases, kind of like dogs do as well. And non-play rats smell much less butts. Another interesting characteristic of the non-play rats is that when they achieve sexual maturity, the non-play rats have much less sex, even if they're surrounded with play rats. And when they do actually engage in sexual activity, they ejaculate much less than the rats who had the opportunity to play. And for me, it makes sense without getting way into taboo subjects that when we are initially interacting with one another in a playful environment, we're exploring our surroundings and our capacity to interact with one another physically, right? Without being too awkward. We know where the boundaries are. We know how it feels like to get closer and closer to one another, right? Which is something that, of course, kids do all the time through play, highly physical play. And once we're in our adolescence and into sexual maturity, that exploration that we initiated in the play phase will translate, of course, to our capacity to have physical contact with one another. And so I'm not saying that Energizers are going to make us better lovers, but what I am saying is that there's a very interesting link to the themes that Andrew Huberman discussed, right? This contingency exploring under low risks and relatively low stress that resonates a lot with, for example, going out on your first date, right? You're taking risks. Hopefully they're not too enormous risks. You're exploring contingency. What's it like to interact with this human? Do I want them as part of my future life? And so this bridge between play life or Energizers and real life and real business world, for me, they're crystal clear, and hopefully they'll become more of a connected realm for you too as this course goes on. Anyway, I'm going to let Peter talk a little bit more.
Play is where children learn that they're in control of their own life. It's really the only place they are in control of their own life. When we take that away, we don't give them the chance to learn how to control their own life. Play is where they learn to solve their own problems and learn, therefore, that the world is not so scary after all. Play is where they experience joy and they learn the world is not so depressing after all. Play is where they learn to get along with peers and see from others' points of view and practice empathy and get over narcissism. Play is by definition creative and innovative. Of course, if you take away play, all these things are going to go down. And yet, the hue and cry that we hear everywhere is for more school, not for more play. And we've really got to change that.
It's a tricky thing to study a brain at play. For one thing, you can't use human brains. Not many parents would sign up to have their kids' brain fiddled with. But rats? They're a different story. One of the main scientists who studies play in rats is a guy named Jaak Panksepp. Some people also know him as the rat tickler. You'll find out why a little later.
Every human being knows what play is. Every child knows what play is. I can recognize it in a snap. The problem was, can you bring that into the laboratory?
Jaak wanted to know where in the brain play comes from. Is it a learned activity that's developed in the outer cortex, the most recently evolved part of the brain? Or is it a basic, ancient function of the bottom part, like eating and sleeping and sex? Jaak came up with a pretty straightforward way to answer that question. What he did was surgically remove the cortex from the brains of young rats, and then he waited to see if they still wanted to play with their full-brained friends. They did! They tussled and wrestled just like normal rats, and that's essentially what rat play is.
It's like professional wrestling. Why do people enjoy professional wrestling? It's all theater, we know that, but we still enjoy it.
The rats would even chase a human hand that had played with them, hoping for more play. And that is how the rat tickler got his name.
I had 2 young kids that loved tickle games, so I just, made it smaller for a rat.
Since even rats missing the most highly evolved layer of their brains sought out play, the experiment showed that the play impulse must have come from a deep and primitive part of the brain, one that's most likely shared with all mammals and lots of other animals too. To be in such an ancient place in the brain, Jaak and others think play must be vital to survival. Otherwise, the playful rats would have died off a long time ago. Playing rats would presumably make easier prey for watchful predators. But they didn't die off. Instead, they thrived. Why? Scientists still disagree about that, but Jaak and a lot of others think that the reason play exists is because it develops what in humans we might call social skills.
As soon as you begin to play, you begin to learn about the social world.
Jaak's rats are learning about the give and take of interactions and finding out where the limits are. Play may be the mechanism that allows animals to learn to live in social groups and to navigate complex hierarchies and social situations.
Play is a very valuable, it's not just superfluous, it's a very valuable thing for child development. And we as a culture have to learn how to use it properly, and we have to make sure our kids get plenty of it.
Jaak Panksepp witnessed what might be the best anecdotal evidence for his theory when he watched what happened in the lab when 2 boy rats were put in a room with a single girl rat. The one boy rat who had had lots of play growing up was basically the rat version of George Clooney. The other guy didn't stand a chance.